Doings of Doyle is sponsored by Belanger Books, home of the best Sherlock Holmes anthologies featuring today's top Sherlockian authors. Belanger Books is the only authorised publisher of Solar Ponds mysteries, continuing the Sherlock Holmes legacy into the 21st century. Visit them today at belangerbooks.com. Welcome to Doings of Doyle, a podcast dedicated to the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Professor Challenger, Brigadier Gerard, and, of course, Sherlock Holmes. I'm Mark Jones.
And I'm Paul Chapman, and together we'll be exploring Doyle's eclectic bibliography to understand more about the great man's life and work. We'll be discussing his fiction and non-fiction, the well-known and the obscure.
And stopping by Baker Street along the way. You can find out more at doingsofdoyle.com or follow us at Doings of Doyle on Twitter. Hello and welcome to episode 35. Today we join a cast of Conan Doyle's literary heroes in his amusing short story A Literary Mosaic, also known as Cyprian Overbeck Wells, which first appeared in December 1886. And here's Paul to tell us more.
Smith is an aspiring young writer whose confidence in his own abilities is unfortunately at odds with the opinions of publishers and their editors. He is also currently suffering from a severe bout of writer's block. However, one evening as he dozes by his fireside, following a satisfying meal, a pint of beer and a pipeful of tobacco, he mysteriously finds himself in the company of some of English literature's greatest luminaries, who promptly embark upon a collaborative literary adventure, both salutary and improbable.
A Literary Mosaic is an intriguing story in that little, if anything, is known about its origins, but there is some contextual evidence in the story to date its writing. It opens with the narrator, Smith, bemoaning his many attempts to get published, and in particular, the horror of seeing the little cylinders of manuscript returned by, quotes, a remorseless postman. And this was an all too familiar experience for Conan Doyle, who in mid-1886, when we think this was written, he was trying very hard to get his first novel published. At this time, the firm of Girdleston and A Study in Scarlet were both doing the rounds of publishers. And he would later write that Girdleston used to come circling back with the precision of a homing pigeon. But it was actually the lack of attention paid to A Study in Scarlet that bothered him more. I was hurt, he wrote, for I knew that it deserved a better fate. James Payn applauded, but found it both too short and too long, which was true enough. Arrowsmith received it in May 1886 and returned it unread in July. 2 or 3 others sniffed and turned away. And in a letter to his mother, he wrote, "My poor study has never even been read by anyone except Payn. Verily, literature is a difficult oyster to open." And it was at this time, amid these disappointments, that he most likely wrote this little story of a frustrated author, with more than a little dose of self-deprecation thrown into the mix. Smith actually says in the story that it begins about 20 minutes to 10 on the night of the 4th of June, 1886, which is as fair an estimate of the approximate time of writing as any. So while Conan Doyle was struggling with getting a first novel published, he had already had success with getting short stories into print, and A Literary Mosaic appeared first in The Boy's Own Paper in its Christmas number 1886. That magazine had previously published Conan Doyle's An Exciting Christmas Eve in December 1883, which we featured in episode 9, and it was about to start serializing Uncle Jeremy's Household, which we covered in episode 17. Conan Doyle's introduction to The Boy's Own Paper had been through Major General Alfred Wilkes Drayson, who was president of the Portsmouth Literary and Scientific Society, who we've mentioned in previous episodes. Drayson was a retired army officer, an astronomer, an exponent of psychic phenomena, spiritualism, and theosophy. And when A Literary Mosaic was collected for the first time in The Captain of the Pole Star and Other Tales in 1890, Conan Doyle dedicated that collection to Drayson. And it was in that collection that the story was first renamed Cyprian Overbeck Wells and subtitled A Literary Mosaic. And it's said that Conan Doyle had planned to reissue the story again at some point, probably in the 1910s, in another collection, but that volume didn't come to pass. In that aborted work, he was to remove a reference to James Payn, Walter Besant, Ouida and Stevenson as, quotes, among the living, as by then they'd passed. When the story did appear again in Tales of Twilight and the Unseen in 1922, and in the Conan Doyle stories in 1929, both times as a literary mosaic, it didn't remove the reference to Among the Living.
Yes, it's particularly interesting story, this one, in terms of the autobiographical or semi-autobiographical elements within it.
Mm.
We don't know the exact timing of some of the other works that are being written around it, but one of the things which is floating about at this time is Doyle's first novel, which was Firm of Girdleston would become his earliest published novel. But he was also writing a novel called The Narrative of John Smith,
Mm.
which at one point disappeared completely,
Yes.
was lost in the post. And then he set about rewriting this. And that he left unfinished, and it was eventually published in 2011
Mm.
when it emerged from the long disputed Conan Doyle archive. But it is interesting that you got that story, The Narrative of John Smith, and the main character of this is called simply Smith.
Yes.
So you kind of got this similarity of character going on, and he's using the deliberately anonymous name of
Yeah.
Smith,
Yeah.
because in both these stories he's essentially writing about himself.
Mm.
And the other the background material you've got going on here is Smith in a literary mosaic has these literary ambitions, but he has to make a living, so he becomes a clerk in a firm that's shipping goods to and from West Africa.
Mm.
And the firm at the centre of the Firm of Girdleston
Yes.
is a shipping firm which is sending goods to and from West Africa.
Mm.
So that's an element from that which comes in. But there's also this element of Conan Doyle's own literary method and his frustration
Yes. Yeah.
of his failures at this time. And you've got Smith in a literary mosaic, um, you know, moaning to himself about the article in question had been sent to well nigh every publisher in London and had come back again with a rapidity and precision which spoke well for the efficiency of our postal arrangements.
Yes.
Had my manuscripts been paper boomerangs, they could not have returned with greater accuracy to their unhappy dispatcher. Oh, the vileness and utter degradation of the moment when that stale little cylinder of closely written pages, which seemed so fresh and full of promise a few days ago, is handed in by a remorseless postman. And we know from works like Memories and Adventures that this is Conan Doyle's own experiences
Yes.
being written up
Yeah.
here. And note that particular mention of the stale little cylinder, because
Mm.
Conan Doyle always sent his manuscripts out in a cardboard cylinder rather than flat.
Mm.
So you've got a definite
Yeah.
reference there. I mean, in Memories and Adventures itself, Conan Doyle's talking about the trips that the Firm of Girdleston constantly went on. He says, when I sent it to publishers and they scorned it, I quite acquiesced in their decision and finally let it settle after its periodical flights to town, a dishevelled mass of manuscript at the back of a drawer. So yeah, these experiences that Smith is undergoing are quite definitely autobiographical. It's quite nice in that there's no element of self-pity going on here with
No.
Doyle. It is self-deprecation.
Yes.
It's
Absolutely.
having fun at his own expense, which he does as well in Memories and Adventures and other reminiscences where he actually talks of these experiences.
Yes. He has a couple of other bits in there that are sort of autobiographical as well. As you mentioned, of course, the West Africa experience in Firm of Girdleston, and that and the reference here draws on Conan Doyle's experience on the Mayumba,
Mm, mm,
October 81 to January 82, when he was a ship's surgeon ever so briefly. And there's a moment in a literary mosaic where Smith is toying with a dispatch to a captain, isn't it? It's meant to be a dispatch
yes.
to a captain, which he has decided to put in the form of poetry. And the actual directions that the captain is meant to follow is the
Mm,
exact route that Conan Doyle followed on the
mm.
Mayumba.
Well, I think it's worth quoting in full, though, because
Mm.
it is rather. From England, Captain, you must steer a course directly to Madeira, land the casks of salted beef, then away to Tenerife. Pray be careful, cool and wary, with the merchants of Canary. When you leave them, make the most of the trade winds to the coast. Down it you shall sail as far as the land of Calabar, and from there you'll onward go to Bonnie and Fernando Po. So yes, these are the places which Doyle visited on the Mayumba.
On the Mayumba. And the other thing that happened on the Mayumba on the way back from Fernando Po was that they picked up a great dignitary. They picked up
Mm,
Henry Highland Garnet, who is the American consul to Liberia,
mm,
and he was picked up and deposited at Liberia, and he actually died about a month later. But Henry
mm,
Highland Garnet's an incredible figure, a radical abolitionist, born into slavery, escaped with his family, age 9, smuggled out on the Underground Railroad, and then became a abolitionist and a clergyman. And he was at the more radical end in that he supported sort of
mm,
John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859. When the 13th Amendment passed in 1865, he was actually the first black preacher to speak before the US House of Representatives. Quite an amazing figure for Conan Doyle to have rubbed
mm,
shoulders with. But
mm,
the interesting point is that he and Garnet spoke extensively about literary figures and people that had influenced themselves.
mm.
People like, I think they discussed Ralph Waldo Emerson and Washington Irving, and then a group of historians that they were both interested in as well. And I just wondered whether there's something in the nature of that conversation that he had with Garnet on the Mayumba about all these different literary characters that sort of feeds in some way unconsciously into a literary mosaic.
Mm.
The other semi-autobiographical piece in here, I think, is this idea that Conan Doyle is trying to find his own voice as an author. And you get a little hint of that in here with Smith, who says at one point, "For some time past I had avoided opening any work of fiction because one of the greatest faults of my youth had been that I invariably and unconsciously mimicked the style of the last author whom I had happened to read." Now, obviously, that's a setup for how this story functions, but also, it's something that Owen Dudley Edwards pointed out is something that you see in very, very early Conan Doyle works, where he is, as we've said in previous episodes, he's sort of mimicking Mayne Reid or Bret Harte, or picking up on many of those writers. Firm of Girdleston being a classic case in point, because there's lots of Dickens in there and other writers as well.
Yeah, 'cause, I mean, in Girdleston as well as Dickens, you've also got obvious reflections of Wilkie Collins and
Mm.
Sheridan Le Fanu. And in fact, this is again, Doyle kind of often never hides his sources, because he actually calls one of the characters in Girdleston Le Fanu,
Yes.
which kind of gives things away
Bit of a
just
giveaway.
ever so slightly. Um, you just quoted part of Smith's own approach
Mm.
and methodology, and I'll just give here the full quote that comes from, because I think it is very interesting in the context of possibly Conan Doyle's own methodology.
Mm.
Where you have Smith saying, "In this strait, I determined to devote my leisure to running rapidly through the works of the leading English novelists, from Daniel Defoe to the present day, in the hope of stimulating my latest ideas and of getting a good grasp of the general tendency of literature. And then for some time past I had avoided opening any work of fiction, because one of the greatest faults of my youth had been that I invariably and unconsciously mimicked the style of the last author whom I had happened to read. Now, however, I made up my mind to seek safety in a multitude, and by consulting all the English classics, to
Mm.
avoid the danger of imitating anyone too closely. I had just accomplished the task of reading through the majority of the standard novels at the time when my narrative commences." And you wonder with Doyle himself, it seems from an early age he'd actually gone out of his way almost to familiarise himself with the works of the standard authors,
Yes.
both in terms of fiction and going for the great historians and
Mm.
essayists, and so getting this wider grasp. And one of the stories he tells in Memories and Adventures, he talks about his general aspiration towards literature was tremendously strong. My mind was reaching out in what seemed an aimless way in all sorts of directions. I used to be allowed twopence for my lunch, but near the pie shop was a second-hand bookshop with a barrel full of old books and the legend, "Your choice for twopence," stuck above it. Often the price of my luncheon used to be spent on some sample out of this barrel, and I have within reach of my arm as I write these lines copies of Gordon's Tacitus, Temple's works, Pope's Homer, Addison's Spectator, and Swift's works, which all came out of the twopenny box. Anyone observing my actions and tastes would have said that so strong a spring would certainly overflow. So he's obviously been setting out
Mm.
deliberately to familiarise himself, even on this the limited budget,
Mm.
into the classics, and you're getting this really reflected
Yes.
in this uh, on the surface comical story,
Yeah,
but there's so much else going
there
on there.
is. Yes, and you can almost feel that sense of almost a kind of pressure on Conan Doyle to create some kind of great work, either because he expected that he should be capable of doing it, or indeed maybe
Mhm.
his mother or family influences
Mhm.
suggesting that he should. And there's even a little autobiographical element within a literary mosaic where Smith says, finding myself independent, I rented a quiet house removed from the uproar and bustle of London, and there I settled down with the intention of producing some great work which should single me out from the family of the Smiths. And while Smith might not be from a particularly distinguished background, Doyle obviously was. The Doyle family had his grandfather, he had his Uncle Dickie Doyle, and two other uncles, both of whom were distinguished in their own right. His father had felt that pressure of trying to succeed with the Doyle family name as well, and you can sort of sense in this moment in the story a little bit of pressure applying to Conan Doyle. The other thing, of course, is that this reference to trying to become independent and making a name on his own also alludes to that time in Southsea where he was offered money from the Doyle family
Mhm.
to the Catholic Doyle family to set up as he sort of restored his Catholic faith, and of course he rejected the money. So there are a couple of things going on in that little sentence as well, I think.
And coming back to the question of Conan Doyle's methodology, and research methods
Mm,
and all that aspect, you can see elements in a literary mosaic which are reflecting a story which was published 3 years earlier, in December 1883, called "Selecting a Ghost"
mm,
or "The Ghosts of Goresthorpe Grange,"
yeah.
um, in which a very foolish jumped up character, who's sort of like Smith, but far more pretentious,
Yes.
and even more foolish in his way. A parvenu grocer who's become rich, called
Yes.
Argentine Dodd,
Yeah.
who buys an ancient pile and decides it must have a ghost. So he then he has this strange experience where he ends up selecting ghosts, and it's all, he has to see a doctor afterwards, and the doctor tells him, "You tell me in your note that your mind was saturated with ghostly literature. You had long taken a morbid interest in classifying and recalling the various forms in which apparitions have been said to appear." So basically, Dodd's been doing what Smith does, and what we end up with in a literary mosaic is they have a similar experience.
Yeah.
This mind saturation shows itself up in a peculiar way.
Yeah. And so
Mm.
as Smith is enjoying his after meal drink and his pipe, he starts to descend in this slumber, and the table in his room starts to be populated with all these great literary characters from
Mhm. You
uh,
can almost see the 1970s wibbly wobbly
yeah, they
television
do.
effect
They do. They do.
as it happens.
They do. They do. That's right. And then they start to appear out of the vapors of this pipe, and suddenly we've got this whole cast of great literary figures sat around the table. Yeah.
Yes, and amongst them are Charles Dickens, Charles Lamb, Henry Fielding, Samuel Richardson, Lawrence Sterne, Captain Marryat, James Payn, Walter Besant, Robert Louis Stevenson, William Makepeace Thackeray, George Eliot, and Ouida. So you'll notice amongst these names, it's a real mix of 17th through to 19th century
Mm,
writers. But Smith also makes an interesting side comment, which again could reflect on Conan Doyle, and his own family connections,
Mm.
almost slips in here, where Smith, while he's looking at this gathering, says, while among those at the far side, the majority were dressed in the most modern style, and among them I saw, to my surprise, several eminent men of letters whom I had the honour of knowing.
Yeah.
So he's giving the idea he mixes in some of these
Yes.
circles as well. Now, whether he's overplaying his role,
Mm.
he's just seen these individuals in a club or a pub or something, or whether he actually knows them. We don't, that knows them in a sense of as friends or real acquaintances. But
Yes.
I just think it's just an interesting thing to be dropped in.
Yeah, it is. It's
Mm,
another classic sort of Conan Doyle name dropping
mm,
exercise as well, as we saw in Memories and Adventures.
mm,
And then as the figures materialize around the table, they decide they're going to get Smith started with his story, and they look around as to who to get started. And five of the novelists take part. Really, I mean, there are others doing occasional interjections, but essentially five, and they're Defoe, Swift, Smollett, Scott, and Bulwer Lytton. Um, and naturally, they all turn to Defoe to get them started, since Defoe is, regarded really as the father of the English novel. Defoe is very sort of self-effacing again, says, nay, gossips, he said, there are others more worthy, but he was interrupted by loud cries of no, no from the whole table. And of course, Conan Doyle takes us straight into uh, Defoe giving Smith the opening, which describes Cyprian Overbeck Wells and how he got his name and where he was born. And this is straight out of the first couple of paragraphs of Robinson Crusoe. I was born in the year 1632 in the city of York, of a good family, though not of that country, my father being a foreigner of Bremen, etc., etc., etc. So, he dips straight into this. But one of the things that really interested me in the Defoe sequence was that Defoe very quickly, even before he starts the narration, mentions Lord Rochester, and this is very interesting because it's an incidental detail that doesn't really need to be here in the story at all, but could be again, as very relevant when you think about the points you were making, Paul, about Conan Doyle's writing method and his influences. Rochester was a notorious Restoration rake who died of syphilis aged 33, and he wrote famously lewd poetry, and was probably the author of a playlet called Sodom, or the Quintessence of Debauchery, from 1672, which seemed to sum up the Restoration age, and was almost designed to upset the Puritans. And Defoe was hugely enamored of Rochester. He really enjoyed his work. In fact, it's referenced some 60 times in Defoe's work, more than any other author, making him part of the sort of furniture of his mind. And in fact, even Moll Flanders quotes Rochester at some point. But it was John McVeagh, an academic writing in 1974, pointed out that Rochester had kind of infected Defoe's imagination in a quite unhelpful way, and that Defoe was both drawn to the personality of Rochester, but then sort of repelled by some of the politics and philosophy therein. And that accounts, in McVeigh's eyes, to the discrepancies that you sometimes get in Defoe about the nature of mankind, particularly in Robinson Crusoe. So it's interesting that you get this kind of crisis of an author being influenced by another author reflected even before the story of Cyprian Overbeck Wells begins. The other thing that McVeagh says, though, is that Defoe was in the habit of soaking up all sorts of ideas like a sponge and using them if they appealed to him, no matter where they came from. He contradicts and trips over himself because conflicting kinds and traditions of thought meet in him and are not perfectly harmonized. And that's almost a description of what happens here in Literary Mosaic. And then, of course, Defoe passes the story across to the next novelist in the line, and that is Jonathan Swift, or Dean Swift, as they refer to him, because, of course, he was an Anglican clergyman as well. And naturally enough, Conan Doyle here is pastiching Gulliver's Travels. So immediately, this character of Cyprian Overbeck Wells, who has been created by Defoe, then ends up being shipwrecked. And one of the things that, of course, Swift is known for is this kind of great deal of nautical detail that he would throw into some of these early sections. And but this doesn't go down quite so well with the literary company that we have around the table. So there's this great moment. At the description of this nautical manoeuvre, I observed that Smollett grinned, and a gentleman who was sitting higher up the table in the uniform of the Royal Navy, and who I guessed to be Captain Marryat, became very uneasy and fidgeted in his own seat. So clearly Swift not quite as well on the nautical detail as those two who had both served in the Navy, of course. But this whole business of it being a pastiche of Gulliver then sort of irritates Lawrence Sterne.
Yes, Sterne rather testily and in an undertone goes, a second edition, Gulliver served up cold, which then irritates Swift. And you have this wonderful argument between these two writers. There's a wonderful bit in this argument where they're referring to an incident in Sterne's Sentimental Journey, which involves a dead donkey.
A donkey, yes.
Swift says to Sterne, your reverence would fain make a sentimental journey of the narrative, I doubt not, and find pathos in a dead donkey. Though faith, no man can blame thee for mourning over thine own kith and kin. It's just wonderful. And then Sterne is given the offer, and he stands out of it, remarking with a sneer that he was loath to fit a good blade on a poor handle. It's again, it's great stuff, and it as I say, shows Doyle's mastery of humour and absurdity.
Yes,
and again, this where Doyle is often characterised as this kind of big Edwardian, walrus moustached, exemplar of Philistine manhood of that period and sports loving, that he really does enjoy this sort of clever 18th century literature, and you would never associate him as a fan of Tristram Shandy.
No,
which is one of English literature's first real absurdist, even surreal masterpieces.
Yes, yeah.
And so it just shows this kind of width and breadth of Doyle's approach, even at this early stage. I mean, we must remember here this is before the publication of Study in Scarlet, even. And I have to say, while we're discussing Sterne, Mark and I are both lucky enough to live near Coxwold.
Yes,
where Sterne actually wrote Tristram Shandy and Shandy Hall, where he wrote these books. It's still there. It's just a wonderful place to visit, and we're fortunate enough to be able to.
Yes, indeed, and soak up the countryside, which heavily features in those novels.
Yes, completely.
And talking of absurdists, the next one to take over is a rough, weather-beaten man who was smoking a long churchwarden pipe, who is, it turns out, is Tobias Smollett. And Smollett, of course, great pioneer and popularizer of the picaresque novel, especially Roderick Random, The Adventures of Roderick Random, but also The Adventures of Peregrine Pickle and Humphrey Clinker. He's a great one for names. And Smollett looks sort of rather sadly on Smith and says, "Oh, my heart softens for him. Why, gossips, we've been in the same straits ourselves. Gadzooks, never did mother feel more concern for her eldest born than I when Rory Random went out to make his own way in the world," which is, of course, reference to Roderick Random. And Smollett adds the most absurdist element to this whole short story, which concerns a trick played on Jebediah Ankerstock, a shipmate with tattooed eyelids who lives in fear of his Portsmouth fishwife. He thinks he's left on dock, and Cyprian plays a trick on him by telling him that his wife is in his quarters, when in fact it's a sheep dressed up in a dress. And that's a classic sort of Smollett thing. It just sort of this ridiculous kind of over the top humor that you get in many of those novels. And in fact, that character of Jebediah Ankerstock calls to mind one of his famous characters, Commodore Hawser Trunnion, who's from Peregrine Pickle. He's a sea captain who's now retired, lives on land, but insists on running his household like a ship. And in fact, the description of Hawser Trunnion is almost exactly the same as the description of Jebediah Rankerstock in this. So you wonder if that's the story that Conan Doyle was actually had in his mind over Roderick Random, which is referenced in the story. And that probably influences the character in Micah Clarke, but we'll come to that in another podcast. And Conan Doyle had quite a lot of time for Smollett. In fact, he singled him out in Through the Magic Door as one of the great novelists of the 18th century.
Yes, he comments on the moral aspects of Smollett's very broad
Yes.
approach to humour, and Doyle says of him, ethically he is gross, though his grossness is accompanied by a full-blooded humour, which is more mirth-compelling than the more polished wit of his rivals. And by the rivals that he's discussing, when he discusses the 18th century in general, he says, putting aside single books such as Sterne's Tristram Shandy, Goldsmith's Vicar of Wakefield, and Miss Burney's Evelina, there are only 3 authors who count, and they in turn wrote only 3 books each, of first-rate importance. The 3 men are, of course, Fielding, Richardson, and Smollett, whom he then goes on to characterise as a fat little bookseller in the city, a rake-hell wit of noble blood, and a rugged Scotch surgeon from the Navy, the last being Smollett. But it's interesting that Fielding and Richardson are both there.
Yes.
They're both in this room as described by Smith, but they don't say anything. They're just kind of shadowy figures who are there. And it makes you think, why has Doyle excluded them? And one of those reasons, certainly I feel, is that the 18th century writers we get, including Sterne here, are they're humorous writers, they're satirists, they're absurdists, whereas Fielding and Richardson wouldn't quite fit into that.
Yes, absolutely. And it has been said that, without Smollett, there wouldn't have been Charles Dickens as well, because, among the very small selection of books that Dickens' father owned was a selection of Smollett, which he was said to have read and reread until he could virtually recite them. And the Pickwick Papers is itself, has some similarities to Humphrey Clinker in that it's a set of larger-than-life characters who are traveling around the country, and that's got an awful lot of Smollett in it as well.
Yeah, the classic picaresque stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the great inheritance from Smollett, who now is, I think virtually, well, not really remembered very much at all. Just to give you a sense of Smollett's broad sense of humour, he's greatly remembered for his eccentrics. Probably the most famous one is Humphrey Clinker, who is actually an ostler who's called on to become the new postilion of Matthew Bramble's carriage as they move around the country. The former postilion having caused an accident and the carriage having turned. So all the characters are introduced to Clinker. This is what Mrs. Bramble has to say on it. We had scarce entered the room at Marlborough, where we stayed to dine, when Mrs. Bramble exhibited a formal complaint against the poor fellow who had superseded the postilion. She said he was such a beggarly rascal that he had ne'er a shirt to his back, and had the impudence to shock her sight by showing his bare posteriors, for which act of indelicacy he deserved to be set in the stocks. Mrs. Winifred Jenkins confirmed the assertion with respect to his nakedness, observing at the same time that he had a skin as fair as alabaster. And actually, when you get to Eliot's Middlemarch, and Eliot gets referenced in this story as well, there is actually a moment where Mr. Brooke tells Edward Casaubon to get Dorothea to read you light things, Smollett, Roderick Random, Humphrey Clinker. They are a little broad, but she may read anything now she's married, I remember they made me laugh uncommonly. There's a droll bit about a postilion's breeches. So there you go. Clearly, Smollett's reputation preceded him.
But as you say, it sadly hasn't continued, and again,
No.
it's notable that Sterne remains known.
Yes, indeed.
And still very popular. Tristram Shandy's characters are still in the popular culture. And obviously, you think of this period. Richard Brinsley Sheridan, his characters are still very much in the culture, but Smollett has certainly disappeared.
And then Smollett, having managed to get Cyprian Overbeck Wells as far as a pub, says, "Odds bodkins, I never could pass a comfortable hostel without stopping." And then he immediately passes the story over to Sir Walter Scott. And Scott decides he can only really take on the story if he takes the main character back in time to 1450, which is fantastic. And the whole Scott sequence is based around Jack Cabe's rebellion, which was a great peasant uprising in the middle of the 15th century. And I think this is really a section. I greatly enjoyed this section of the story, because this is Conan Doyle showing his incredibly deep knowledge and love of Scott while also playing with it mercilessly. You get some lines in here which are just classic Scott, but just taken to 11. Probably my favourite one in there is, by St. Anselm of the Holy Grove, thou hadst best have never been born than rouse my spleen this night. Wherefore is it that you and your men are trailing over the moor like a flock of geese when Michaelmas is near? It's absolutely ludicrous, but it's wonderful stuff. It's really good stuff, and he clearly adores Scott. And but it shows how much he's sort of completely internalized this work, because while he is taking it deliberately over the top as well, you can see in here all the makings of the White Company and Sir Nigel.
Oh, there's a germ of a really good story going on.
Yeah, there is actually.
That's
The Jack Cade, yes, there is. Yeah, there is. There absolutely is. And you got, because Cyprian Overbeck Wells now, the other thing that Sir Walter Scott does is gives Cyprian a knighthood. So he's now Sir Overbeck, and is given the choice of either joining the peasant uprising or fighting against it. And it's when he discovers that Jack Cabe has designs on getting rid of the nobles, that's it now. Sir Overbeck cannot be part of it, and a duel is about to ensue. But it is wonderful stuff, and obviously Conan Doyle. We've not really spoken about Scott much on the podcast. He comes up time and time again, but he is such an enormous influence on Conan Doyle. I mean, Through the Magic Door, the second chapter is devoted entirely to Scott, and he says in that he has an olive green line of Scott's novels. They were the first books I ever owned, long before I could appreciate or even understand them. But at last I realized what a treasure they were. In my boyhood, I read them by surreptitious candle ends in the dead of night, when the sense of crime added a new zest to the story. And in terms of Conan Doyle's hero worship of Scott, he gives him the great accolade of writing what is, in his view, the second best novel in the English language, which was Ivanhoe. He reserved the best for Charles Reade's The Cloister and the Hearth, which virtually nobody reads these days. Ivanhoe, I think, still has a bit of a readership, but he isn't so blind to Scott as to know that there aren't problems with some of his writing as well. So he says in Through the Magic Door, there is, I admit, an intolerable amount of redundant verbiage in Scott's novels. Those endless and unnecessary introductions make the shell very thick before you come to the oyster. Digression and want of method and order are traditional national sins. Our sense of form is lamentably lacking, and Sir Walter sinned with the rest. And that's a bit like the whole way in which a literary mosaic works. It's all digression, isn't it? It's all sort of moving around the sides of the central story. And there was another academic article I picked up, this time from 2014. Timothy C. Baker wrote an article called A Scott-Haunted World, and he talks about how Scott is a profound influence on the Scottish Gothic more broadly, and how he himself is almost a haunting figure over Scottish writers then and now, actually. But again, there is this recognition that there are problems with Scott's writing. In fact, Baker reminds us of Robert Louis Stevenson's criticism of Scott, that he was a delightful man, sane, courageous, and admirable, but that his novels were, quotes, full of sawdust.
I mean, the whole thing with Scott, and what we need somebody to do actually is write a book on Scott's influence on 19th century literature generally.
That's right.
Because he's so huge. I mean, on the writers we've mentioned there, Sheridan Le Fanu, Scott was a massive influence on him. He overshadows the 19th century fiction in many, well, certainly 19th century English fiction in many, not just Scottish.
Yes.
It really, we're talking English fiction generally. And Doyle was obviously very much enthralled to this, and this is part of, I feel anyway, a part of his annoyance at Sherlock Holmes. is
Yes.
that Doyle kind of wanted to be seen as a successor to Scott, be seen as the new Scott in many ways.
Mm.
But one of the others who was also in that field was the next speaker in Literary Mosaic, who takes over the story, Sir Edward Bulwer-Lytton, who he himself he wrote in many fields, but he is known, amongst others, for medieval epics like The Last of the Barons and Rienzi, and so he carries on the story, and in very much in that vein, and is then chided
Yes.
by a lot of the other writers. This is you're just repeating the last chap. Why don't
Yes.
you do it in your own style? And this is where we get to Bulwer-Lytton, the writer of Rosicrucian occult fiction. Yes, Doyle, really enjoyed Bulwer-Lytton's supernatural and Rosicrucian fiction.
Mm.
I'm thinking of novels like Zanoni and A Strange Story,
Mm.
and perhaps the story that Bulwer-Lytton is most remembered for to this day, The Haunted and the Haunters,
Yes.
or The
Yeah.
House and the Brain, from 1851,
Mm.
which in Through the Magic Door, Doyle describes as the very best ghost story that I know. So
Mm.
it's pretty high praise, but he can also see the faults in Lytton's style, because Lytton was a practicing occultist, a practicing Rosicrucian.
Yes.
That he also fell into the fault that so many of these writers and believers do, and write in this obscurantist style.
Yes.
It's just full of meaningless verbiage.
Yes.
And in selecting a ghost, Doyle had already spoofed this style, where the Bulwer-Lytton ghost comes up. And I am the invisible nonentity. I have affinities and am subtle. I am electric, magnetic, and spiritualistic. I am the great ethereal sigh heaver. And you've got this same sort of thing comes up in A Literary Mosaic, where Lytton, after being chided by the other writers for being too like Scott, then goes completely over the top with the occult stuff, and
Oh,
this
yes.
figure just appears to Sir Overbeck in his prison, and then it describes itself as, I am the eternal non-ego. I am the concentrated negative, the everlasting essence of nothing. You see in me that which existed before the beginning of matter, many years before the commencement of time. I am the algebraic X, which represents the infinite divisibility of a finite particle. Absolute nonsense. And he goes on like this for several paragraphs. And at the end, he notices that Smollett is giggling.
Yes.
So he's, may I ask, Mr. Smollett, what you find to laugh at? Gadzooks, master, cried Smollett, who had been sniggering for some time back. It seems to me that there is little danger of anyone venturing to dispute that style with you. It's all your own, murmured Sir Walter. And very pretty too, quoth Lawrence Sterne with a malignant grin. Pray, sir, what language do you call it?
Yes, indeed.
And then Bulwer-Lytton, as was his way in life, he's, as one critic says, he bruised like a peach. He then gathers all his papers together and storms off in a dudgeon. But he was, I mean, he was, yeah, parodied in his lifetime by so many people who enjoyed the fact that they knew it hit.
Yes. Yeah.
And one of his main tormentors was Thackeray, who
Yeah.
interestingly is in the room again in this story, but it's the 18th century
Yes.
characters who are having a dig at Lytton rather than Thackeray in this. But Thackeray just poked fun in a similar way to Doyle here. But there's a fantastic spoof that Thackeray wrote of more Bulwer-Lytton's dandy phase, when he hung about with Disraeli and wrote society
Oh,
novels. And
yes.
he has a character just saying, "What is the unintelligible but the ideal? What is the ideal but the beautiful? What is the beautiful but the eternal? And the sport of the men who would commune with these is like him who shrinks awestruck before that azure mystery. So poor old Bull was just getting this all the time. And when he added Lytton to his name, when Edward Bulwer became Edward Bulwer Lytton, again, Thackeray is quite merciless, in which the Lytton character in another one of his spoofs is made to sign himself EL, BL, BBL. BBBLLL, and so poor old Bulwer Lytton, he's just subject to this throughout his life, and yeah, he's still to this day, he's mocked as one of the worst writers, but he isn't anywhere near as bad as people
Oh,
say he is.
no.
And of course, he did open one novel with that classic line: "It was a dark and stormy
Stormy
night."
Night. That's right,
Mm.
yes.
I mean, one of the surprising things with him, because he was a politician as well as a writer, and I think you've found, Mark, a review
Oh,
of
yes.
Captain of the Pole Star.
Yeah, that's from the St. James Gazette, their review of the Captain of the Pole Star when it came out in 1890. And they said the best stories in the volume, which is bright and clever throughout, are J. Habakkuk Jeffson's statement and A Literary Mosaic, though in the latter, Dr. Doyle seems to mix up the Earl of Lytton and his father.
Yeah, it comes from the moment in A Literary Mosaic when Bulwer Lytton's rummaging amongst his papers and goes, that's a report of mine when I was in India. Bulwer Lytton was never in India. His son, the first Earl of Lytton, was the Viceroy of India between 1876 to 1880, but he lost his post thanks to the disaster of the Second Afghan War, in which a certain Dr. Watson was wounded and invalided home. But Bulwer Lytton himself was Secretary of State for the Colonies between 1858-59. And what surprised everybody was that he made rather a good job of it.
Yes, he did. Yes, that's right. And then when dear old Bulwer has stomped off in disgrace, the story pretty much ends, and it has that kind of vague feeling of a kind of 1960s Monty Python sketch where you have a series of clever points made to show that you're knowledgeable and studious in a particular area, and then there's a complete lack of a punchline, and it's the weakest bit of the story is that it just sort of peters out remarkably quickly. But there are other literary figures within there, but probably more interesting in a way is who is left out.
Yeah, it's you go through the writers he admired, and at first you think, well, where are people like Carlyle, Gibbon, Macaulay, and then you realise he does say this is writers of fiction.
Yes, yeah,
But some of his favourites are missing. I mean, Bret Harte isn't there. Edgar Allan Poe's not there.
yeah,
Perhaps
Poe,
because they're Americans.
yeah,
But he doesn't make that clear. But perhaps the greatest absences are two of his favourite writers, George Meredith, who had a great admiration for, and the aforementioned Charles Reade,
yes,
author of The Cloister and the Hearth, who again was another one of these writers who wrote in different styles, different genres. Cloister and the Hearth is a great sprawling sort of medieval epic. But he also wrote things like It's Never Too Late to Mend,
oh yes,
which is a kind of morality story about criminals reforming themselves, and so he was interested in the social novel, the contemporary social novel,
yes,
as well, and hugely popular. I mean, these things sold by the ton. So it is very strange that he's missing, but then again, it's also notable that the writers who are present in this story, who Doyle might describe as the moderns, don't actually get a voice. There's one point just before, I think it's just before Scott takes over, where somebody called James,
yes,
one of the moderns, is asked to take over. It's just about to start, and then Scott butts in.
yeah,
And this is probably James Payn,
yes, yeah,
another one of Doyle's favourite writers, and a man who would actually be very influential in really launching Doyle on his successful career.
And in terms of the speaking authors, there are no women in there, no Brontes, no Austens, although we do have two women authors mentioned.
Yeah, George Eliot and Ouida are there, and it's a shame in a way he doesn't introduce Ouida, because there is a writer who, like Bulwer Lytton, is rife for the spoofing.
Yeah, indeed. Yes. And it's a good point you make about the Americans not being reflected there, because you would expect Poe otherwise.
Mm,
Um, the the other person that we might have expected to see in there, possibly, it would, if we were including the Americans, might be Nathaniel Hawthorne, but he might be there in spirit in the background of this story, because there was a review in the San Francisco Chronicle, 1890, again reviewing Captain of the Pole Star and Other Tales when that came out. Which mentioned that A Literary Mosaic was a fantasy, quote, in the style that Hawthorne was so fond of. And if you think about Hawthorne's novels, things that he does often use multiple characters and consecutive narrators to piece together a story
mm,
from different perspectives. I mean, Scarlet Letter has multiple perspectives. House of Seven Gables has several narrators, including a third-person narrator. You have the Blithedale Romance, which has got
mm,
consecutive narrators as well. But whether or not that's so you can sort of see how that kind of format might well have appealed to Conan Doyle. That might have been an influence, although of course he famously said again in Through the Magic Door that Hawthorne was not a particular favourite of his. He said it never appealed to me in the highest degree to me. The fault, I am sure, is my own, but I always seemed to crave stronger fare than he gave me.
mm,
It was too subtle, too
mm,
elusive for effect, and I think that's the clue, isn't it? It is too subtle and
mm,
elusive for effect
mm,
for Conan Doyle.
mm,
But maybe Hawthorne is there a bit in spirit. And talking of spirits, this whole format of this story reminded me a bit of something that Conan Doyle says in the preface to Through the Magic Door, when he talks about the library almost being the
mm.
embodiment of past authors. He says, each cover of a true book enfolds the concentrated essence of a man. The personalities of the writers have faded into the thinnest shadows as their bodies are into impalpable dust. Yet here are their very spirits at your command. And that notion of the spirits here at your command is kind of what's happening, that Smith is summoning them up in his hour of need.
And in the same source, the early part of Through the Magic Door, Doyle also says when you're sitting in your library, you're looking at your shelves, and the dead are such good company that one may come to think too little of the living.
Mm. And of course, in his later spiritualist years, I mean, Conan Doyle did actually claim, or it was claimed on his behalf, I'm not sure if it was actually his claim directly, that he was communing with the spirits of past authors. He was said to have been discussing with Dickens the conclusion of Edwin Drood, and I think also Thackeray and maybe Tolstoy, which have been quite amazing. I'm not sure what a Conan Doyle Tolstoy mashup would have been like.
And thinking of these many different authors, there was a particular sort of literary parlor game which was popular at this time, where you'd get these multi-authored stories or books.
Mm,
Conan Doyle himself was involved in one called The Fate of Fenella,
mm,
which he contributed a chapter to. Bram Stoker
yes.
was also involved in that one. And I think F. Anstey,
Yeah, he
the
finished
author of
it.
Vice Versa, also wrote with that one. I mean, another example appeared in The Idler in 1894 called The Mystery of Black Rock Creek.
Mm,
Which was, I think, 6 different authors, including Jerome K. Jerome, E.F. Benson, and Eden Philpotts.
mm.
Doyle didn't contribute to that one. I don't know whether he's asked and, and refused, or at the same time, you've got the Stark Munro letters
Mm,
was being serialized in the Idler, so perhaps he just wanted his name associated with that.
yeah.
But yeah, these things were popular. They had a vogue.
Yes. Yeah, indeed.
Mm.
So we're getting close to time here, but there was one thing I just wanted to really finish on as a topic, which was, this story appeared in the Boy's Own paper in 1886, and it strikes me as an odd topic. It's certainly an odd story for that for that magazine, and I just wonder what the readership would have made of it.
I think they'd have been baffled.
Yeah.
I mean,
Very
first time I ever read it, I was baffled.
that's true.
So, what the Boys' Own paper readership thought of it, I don't know. I mean, it's quite fascinating actually, in the where you've found a number of reviews
Mm,
of the time of the Captain of the Pole Star,
yeah,
where you've got reviewers speaking from a higher literary perspective than the average reader of the Boys' Own paper,
yeah.
enjoying this story and
Yes,
picking
yes, yeah.
out as one of the best in Captain of the Pole Star. And the fact that Conan Doyle himself um, allowed it to be republished in the 1920s and was quite happy for it to be republished in the 1920s shows that it's a story he didn't try and suppress or was
Yeah,
embarrassed by.
yeah, yeah. I mean, if you were writing for those kind of boys or audience without sort of stereotyping young boys of that era, I would have
Mm,
thought Marriott would have actually contributed to a section to this.
and perhaps one of Conan Doyle's early youthful favourites of his own would have wandered in, Captain Mayne Reid.
Oh, yes. Absolutely, I would have thought Mayne Reid would have
Mm.
been in there too. Yeah. So, so we discussed what the boys' own readership made of it, but what did you make of it, Paul?
One, I really enjoyed it,
Mm.
and as I say, the first time I read it years ago, I wondered what on earth is this? But as you learn more about Doyle,
Yes.
it's a fascinating story. In that this is him playing about with his own ideas and his own approach to literature. Um, as we've said, trying to find a style and pastiching other writers, testing his style, testing his own skills.
Mm.
And obviously having a lot of fun with this as well. And as I say, it does point out Doyle's unexpected excellence as a humorist.
Yes.
Sometimes he can be very heavy-handed in the way that Edgar Allan Poe was, very clumsy. But I think in this, he really some of the shots really hit home
Yes.
and are laugh out loud funny.
Yeah.
I also think it's a story which benefits from being reread.
Yeah.
You get more and more from it. It falls into place. One reading isn't enough because it's just kind of what on earth is going on, and then as you reread it, you begin to get it, and you begin to get the point of it, and you begin to get this kind of it's this the deliberate side of the divergence.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And the fact that the story itself, the ostensible story about Cyprian Overbeck Wells and his adventures, is an irrelevance.
Yes.
It's a nonsense, and that's not actually the point of what's going on here. So I think it's very rewarding.
Yeah. I think it's more. I think it's more rewarding as a Doylean artifact than it is as
Mm,
a short story, actually, in that
mm,
respect. Because,
mm,
as you say, it if you understand Doyle's method, where he was at the time, what he was struggling with, it makes an awful lot of sense. I think, structurally, as a story, the ending sort of lets it down quite strongly because it just fades out without a punch. The humor within it is what really resonated with me this time round in a way
mm,
that
mm,
actually I think the first reading, like yourself, the first reading I had many, many years ago, I think I read it and sort of passed over it and didn't really think of it again. And sure enough, if you look at the sort of literature and the criticism, very few people have picked up on a literary mosaic. But I think what we're saying here is that this is a really important story. It tells us quite a lot about Conan Doyle and where he was, and it's an important part of his evolution.
and it is. I think again from what we've discussed, it seems to have been written in the summer of 1886.
Mm,
And then published Christmas 1886, and which as you said, Study in Scarlet is doing the rounds, and itself might have been published at that time.
yes.
So we've got its timing is fascinating.
It is. It is.
Mm.
So that brings us to the end of this episode. If you want to read the show notes, you can find them at doingsofdoyle.com. And please leave us a rating or review on your podcaster of choice, or consider sponsoring us on Patreon or on PayPal. You can find out more at the website. So, what have we got on the podcast next time, Paul?
Next time we'll be doing another one of our interview shows, and we'll be speaking to Linda Bailey and Isabel Folleth, who are respectively the author and illustrator of a wonderful new short biography, ostensibly for children, but we can all enjoy it, called Arthur, Who Wrote Sherlock.
Brilliant. We're really looking forward to speaking to Linda and Isabel. So until then, it's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.
Goodbye.
Yes, this comes from a comment when Bulwer Lytton, in A Literary Mistake, is rummaging amongst his papers.
Oh,
And said,
sorry. You called it a literary mistake.
did I?
Yeah.
There's the outtake.
There we go.